I prepare too much material for the speak, but I will try to cut when it's necessary. So the aim of Citeaux was not to create a new spirituality, but to return to the sources of an ancient spirituality, the rule of Saint Benedict from the first half of the 6th century, which, according to the Cistercian founders, had been altered. The Cistercians wanted to return to the rule in what they believed to be its purest and strictest interpretation, stripping it of all the superfluous elements that had been added to it over centuries. However, despite the wisdom and the human qualities it contains, the rules did not really begin to develop until 2 centuries after it was written, thanks to Charlemagne, who died in 814, and his son Louis the Pious, who died 840. The year 910, when Cluny was founded near Mâcon in southern Burgundy, marked the beginning of a revival of Western monasticism. Cluny represented a courageous and successful attempt to restore to monastic life the true spirit of the rule. However, despite its abbots, its piety, its devotion to the rule, its strict observance, and its rigor, which helped to make the Cluniac reform an example for all other monasteries, Cluny was, in some respects, the very opposite of the Cenobitic ideal of the desert. Over the years, frequent and generous donations had poured in. The Greek church surpassed in splendor and size all the buildings of the time. The liturgy was long and highly developed. Finally, the abbots, powerful and respected, were too involved outside the enclosure in the century. As a result, many monks and abbots of the time voiced their discontentment. The 11th and 12th centuries were marked by various movements that wanted to apply a stricter observance of the rule or return to the forgotten ideals of the desert. Bruno of Cologne founded the Carthusian monastery, while the Grand Montin, the Prémontré, the Gilbertine, the Savigny congregation, and many others were born. This movement was also behind the Abbey of Mollem in Burgundy, founded 1075 by Saint Robert. The new abbey was a resounding success. Some 15 years after its foundation, Mollem resembled any prosperous Benedictine abbey of its time. This was not to Robert's liking. He obtained the Archbishop's blessing for a new foundation, and so in the early month of 1098, accompanied by 21 monks, he left Mollem to settle in the Saône Valley, 22 kilometers south of Dijon. Initially, the new foundation was simply called Novum Monasterium, but 1119, it took the name of the site where it had been established, Citeaux. Between 1113 and 15, 4 daughters' abbeys were founded under the abbacy of Stephen Harding. And it is from this point onwards that we can truly speak of the foundation of a new order. I use this word in brackets and refer you to Professor van der Putten's lecture last year, with whom I share the view that it's premature to speak of an order before the mid of 12th century. I should say the 40s rather than the 50s. Each new house had to be economically independent, but was accountable to the abbey that had funded it. Exemption from episcopal jurisdiction enabled Citeaux to develop 2 institutions that made it strong: the system of visits by the abbot fathers and the annual general chapter. The abbot father had to visit his daughter abbeys once a year to ensure that they were running smoothly. This process is not entirely original, as it also goes back to the origin of the congregation of Vallombrosa, but the inspiration obviously came from the convention between Mollem and Olps signed in 1097 under the abbacy of Robert, the founder of Citeaux. According to legislative text, the Cistercian order, in brackets, is characterized by a tree-like organization. Citeaux was the main trunk from which 4 mother branches sprang: La Ferté, Pontigny, Clairvaux, and Morimont. Each monastery was like a new branch on a mother branch and could in turn found abbeys, but the latter would always be attached to one of the 5 primitive lines. Each abbot had to attend a general chapter every year around the Feast of the Holy Cross, 14 September, after which statutes were promulgated. In this presentation of the Cistercian written culture, only examples taken from the Dunes and the Turdus manuscripts will be given. This is logical since this course program is linked to the exhaustive digitization of the Dunes and Turdus manuscripts. As a prelude, here is the copy of the Liber Capituli. That was the plan. I forgot to show you the plan. So that's the plan of the talk. And so the Liber Capituli that Turdus received from Clairvaux, probably at the time of its foundation in 1175. This is an excellent example of how the statutory link between the mother abbey and the daughter abbey could be reflected in manuscripts. A Liber Capituli groups together the readings made in the chapter every morning, the reading of the saints of the day in the martyrology on your left for the 1st January, a chapter of the rule of Saint Benedict. On the right, you have the first chapter, Ausculta o fili precepta magistri. And the third part is the obituary, which mentions each day the brothers, familiars, or benefactors who have died, in this case, in the 16th century rewrite here. Because naturally these leaves wear out and fade quickly, so the medieval model has disappeared. The advantage of this manuscript is that it offers multiple hints for dating. On folio 110 verso, we read a decree of the general chapter of Citeaux held in 1160, according to which the rule of Saint Benedict must be read in each monastery in equal parts each day, and in its entirety within a year. To obtain the prescribed regularity, we find here at the bottom of the folio 110 verso a table covering a cycle of 8 years from 1160 to 1168. The added commemoration also include here on the right a first-hand mention of Henri de Champagne, who died in 1152 when the manuscript was at Clairvaux, and a second-hand edition of Philippe d'Alsace, 1168-1191, Count of Flanders, probably when the manuscripts came into the possession of Turdus, and a third-hand mention of Richard de Lionheart, who died 1199. So here, Ricardi Regis Anglia. So these statutory manuscripts evolve with the time and with usage too, since from the 14th century it seems that the rule was also used commonly in French, the C and D, so on the left side here, and you see the C and the D here in the margin, marking the day of the week for reading. So that was the long introduction. So in the 12th century, Western graphic culture began a process of transformation that accelerated radically in the 13th century. Here, we are at the heart of a documentary revolution, whose early stages are still poorly understood, but in which the Cistercians played an active part. The work of Albert de Rollet clearly shows its emergence during the 12th century, the pre-Gothic or pre-textualis. The broad and square round form of Carolingian script gave way to more narrow, laterally compressed shapes. The circulary lobe of the Ho, for example, tended to become oval. As all the letters followed the tendency, their concentration gave the written line a compactness which was altogether foreign to Carolingian script. This lateral compression was enhanced by the introduction of fusions, in which two adjacent letters are joined together in such a way that part of their strokes are common or overlap. At the same time, the length of ascenders and descenders became reduced and the body height was enlarged. This change in the proportion of letters had implication as it allowed the reduction of distance between the lines, and at the same time was a factor prompting book producers to adopt a two-column layout, as the reading of horizontally and vertically compressed script disposed in long lines would have been arduous. Pre-Gothic script had without doubt a greater weight than Carolingian script generally had. The shading, it means the distinction between bold stroke and serre lines is more pronounced. This combined with the compactness of the script result in a blacker appearance of the text area, a feature that would remain typical of all manuscripts emanating from the pre-Gothic tradition. Other features of the pre-Gothic is the treatment of the feet of minims and ascenders. Here is a strong equalizing tendency apparent. Writing became neutralized. It became difficult to distinguish hands or identify handwriting with any certainty during the 13th century, even more so in the 14th century. All the benefit of easier legibility. Uniformity was not confined to writing. Form and graphic standards were adopted by institution. Standardization, or rather uniformization, charters are all had the same look, and management codices all bore a strong resemblance to each other. These are the features of the period, but there is no doubt that the Cistercian case of charters and records, we would say today the originals, together forming the so-called chartriers in French, and the cartularies, the register in which these originals were copied, according to a precise classification, is prolific. A parallel study of the operation involved in the reorganization, the charters, where these can be identified from the notes on the back of the charters, is essential to understanding the management of archival memory as a whole. In the absence of sufficient monographic studies, it is impossible to draw up a true typology of medieval practices in this field. However, as early as the 13th century, the Cistercians were able to establish a link between the cartularies and the chartriers, thanks to the parallel reading of the note on the backs of the charters and the system of rubrication and classification of cartularies. And this history of cartularization is part of the wider history of library codices, a medium for writing and means of communicating text. The codex is both an instrument of prestige, sacralizing documents, and a tool with pragmatic uses. In both these areas, it provided new solutions, distinct from those offered by the active management of charters. During the 13th century, the book underwent a number of decisive advances: the evolution of the page layout, the development of indexes and search tools within the text, inextricably linked to the cultural change in the West and the spread of its uses. The conversion of charters and records into codices is part of the conical innovation with which I began this section. So where are kept archives, cartularies, codices, and books? They are kept in several places in a Cistercian monastery. The monumental history of Cistercian libraries is rather difficult to write due to a lack of archaeological sources, except perhaps in the case of Citeaux on the picture. But at a late date, the picture of the library in 1509. Few armaria have survived from the 12th and 13th century, mostly in form of small wall alcoves in the cloisters, so here in Boken. Nevertheless, it is accepted that there were two separate rooms, one next to the church in the east wing of the cloister, which would have contained volumes for religious use, armarium pavum, and the other which would have held books for study or meditation. Other places must also have housed books, such as the refectory, the dormitory, infirmary, or novice rooms. As for the archives, there are several references to chests under a staircase leading to the dormitory. Here, this staircase here, beside the chapter room. Chronicles and literary resources are generally poor in terms of precise information. Beyond the construction of the buildings that must have been used to house books, mentions of the scriptorium are rare, and when they do exist, they merely highlight the literate or pious character of a particular monk or abbot. The case of Salem or Wettingen Chronicle, which provide us with the books copied year by year, are rare for the 12th and 13th century. So what are the sources of the written culture? The main sources for study for medieval libraries are preserved manuscripts and ancient catalogs. Since André Villemain in the first half of the 20th century, we are able to get a glimpse of the contents of the Clairvaux library as early as the 12th century, almost 350 volumes. Since Joseph de Guélinck, we know that in the middle of the century, Augustine's opera Omnia were almost there, organized not randomly, but according to the order of the Retractationes by the Bishop of Hippo. Obviously, this was the Cistercian largest library. In more than 60 Cistercian libraries, from Alcobaça in Portugal to Alcel, from the abbeys of Dune Terdus to Morimondo, there was a desire to provide themselves with the library of the fathers. On the map in blue, more than 200 manuscripts. In red, 101 to 200. Elsewhere, according to Isaac de Stella, one of the greatest Cistercian spiritual thinkers of the 12th century, the question arises as to whether there are still gaps, or whether, on the contrary, the spirit of poverty has not played a part as surely as the damage done by the centuries. Here in green, less than 20 manuscripts. Although there were 525 male monasteries at the end of the 12th century, we have preserved manuscripts for only 313 of them. For 200 of these, there are only 1 or 2 manuscripts, usually liturgical. Consequently, for only 1/5 of the Cistercian abbeys can we, with varying degrees of success, assess the contents of the libraries. Despite these gaps, we have tracked down and found for the 12th and 13th centuries almost 6,500 manuscripts still preserved and 15,000 lost. From a qualitative point of view, do all the manuscripts copy or preserve themselves according to a specific plan or a central model to be compared with Bernardine plan in architecture, the Cistercian economic and social model, always with brackets, and the uniformity in the development of the order through successive filiations? The documentation suggests that a set of relationships existed between the Cistercian intellectual center of the West, but was it a network, or rather a centralized and standardized network? Or, on the contrary, should we align ourselves with the opinion of Anne Bondiel-Souchier, according to whom the typical library, whether Cistercian or Cartesian, does not exist? The answer must be subtle, but the Cistercians were part of cross networks, where, as in architecture, local style and style imported from mother abbeys very quickly intersected. I think you will see this sufficiently in the presentation, particularly in the case of the Liber Capituli, shown above, where the link or filiation is essential, and further on with the intense connection between the books owned by secular canons, in this case from Saint Donatian in Bruges, and the nascent library of the Cistercian of Terdust. So point 2. Point 2. I take the title in French, La culture cistercienne et tradition, because it's a very known quotation from Jean Leclerc. So Cistercian culture is tradition. Biblical, first of all. Anima gravida verbi, the soul heavy of the biblical word in a sermon of Guéric Digny. This is how a monk's heart should be. From the patristic period onwards, Lectio Divina was the cornerstone of monasticism. It crops up everywhere in the rule, and the psalm give rhythm to the days 7 times a day. Of course, there is the reading followed and comment on, whether liturgical or not. We find a beautiful evocation of this in Saint Jerome. Let sleep seize you with pen in hand, and let the holy page receive your falling head. But the Bible is above all the object of that chewing, that rumination that permeates the heart, that individual meditation of which the anthropologist Marcel Jousse and many other historians of spirituality have spoken so well. Manuscript 65. Is that right? 65. No, this is 165. Is a Bible, so-called Glossa Ordinaria, given by the canon of Saint Donatian in Bruges, a certain Hugo. The two codicological entities of the manuscripts, a Glossa Ordinaria on Matthew and on Mark, were bound together at Saint Donatian, as were the two glosses of manuscript 71 too, on the Gospel of Luke and the Acts. Why can we be sure of that? Here I have the 65, because the flyleaves of the manuscript 65 and 71 complement each other. Remarkably, they belong to the same document, with mention the tithe due to sin donation around 1130, 1140, and not to a Cistercian abbey. So the two biblical manuscripts donated by the canon Hugo cover only four books of the New Testament, 3 Gospels, and Acts. First of all, this is not an exception. Most of the 500 Cistercian glossed manuscripts prior to the 14th century are limited to one or a few biblical books. The presentation by biblical books for each Cistercian library makes it possible to imagine overall projects in the largest Cistercian abbeys, if not for the 12th century, at least for the following century. Let's take the case of Clairvaux, the largest Cistercian library. Between 1146 and 1149, the son of King Louis VI of France, Prince Henri, became monk at Clairvaux. He brought with him a number of manuscripts, 7 biblical volumes with glosses, some of them written before 1137. It means at a very early date in the history of the glossa, later qualified as ordinaria, since it had been drawn up a few decades earlier by the masters of Flanders, Anselm and Raoul, a work completed by Gilbert known as the Universal. Even if we set aside these early copies of the Glossa Ordinaria, which may have come from Paris workshop of Saint-Victor, there are still nearly 30 glossed manuscripts from the 12th century for the Reigns, the Psalm, the Sapiential books, the Great and Minor Prophets, and all the books of the New Testament. So the Bruges case is rich. Before 1300, 33 manuscripts of glossed Bible coexisted for the mother house of the Dune and its daughter of the Dust. But the distribution illustrates the way in which the two libraries were built up by individual donations and not by a coordinated acquisition by Cistercian cantores, librarians. There are 10 different copies of the Gospel of Matthew, 10. 3 of Luke, 3 of Mark, 2 of John, 2 of Acts, 2 of the Pauline epistles, 2 of the canonical letters, 3 of the Revelation, and far fewer copies for the Old Testament. The distribution itself is very uneven between the two abbeys. Occasionally, 2 volumes of similar content are preserved in 2 abbeys, such as the gloss on Genesis and Exodus, but it is an exception, as the donations date from the end of the 12th century and throughout the 13th century. The versions differ from those with a tentative layout to copies with an extremely elaborate layout. It's not possible. I present here 2 manuscripts, 99, no, 70 and 1010 from the seminary. Before that, the Bible where the layout is still not stabilized. So here we are at the end of the 12th century, and the copyist is trying to find his way to write glosses and the Bible together. And here, the MS-70, so on the left side, offer a wealth of hypertext links, as we should say today, to enable a rapid and modern exegesis of a biblical passage. The central text occupies a variable width, depending on whether the commentaries are long or short. In the case of short etymological, so here, short etymological and lexicographical explanation, the practice of interlinear glosses has been preserved from earliest biblical manuscripts. The pied de mouche, so here, so sort of capitulum abbreviation, alternating blue and red, indicate the glossa ordinaria fixed, stabilized, stratified, well in front of the authoritative text, without it being necessary to repeat the lemma in margin. On the other hand, space is left for the modern glosses, for which a system of cross-references and underlined biblical lemmata can be used to introduce either a new commentary it seems to be the case here, or individual glosses. Note also the three different writing aids and model. So I'm not talking here about the Bible used in liturgy. Diane Rayleigh rightly referred to the phenomenon in manuscript 23 and 33 in a lesson she gave last year, which I recommend for the podcast. I will come back to the question of use of library books for liturgy in a few minutes. In this same lesson, Diane Rayleigh was also surprised to find a list of pericope in the manuscript 5 of Bruges. But there is at least one other in manuscript, the seminary, the first manuscript 1 in the seminary from the mid-13th century, given by the canon of Franco of Maldegem to Terdust. I've not compared the Ordo Librorum, the list of pericopes, with that of MS5, which is the first volume of 3 volumes, 5 plus 7 plus 23, but it would be surprising if it were the same. The latter still date from the 12th century and was given by a priest from Lisseweg, while the second, as we have just said, is from a transitional period in the second quarter of 13th century. And was given by Franco of Maldegem, provost of the chapter Cistercian in Bruges. He succeeded his uncle Willem, who was in charge between 1231 and 1240. The manuscript therefore dates from the middle of the century at the latest, and not from 1300 as stated in the Porter catalogue. Paleographically supports this dating. Why am I spending a few moments on this? Because it shows the Cistercian ability to adapt to a manuscript copied outside the scriptorium. So that's the beginning of Genesis. Terdust inherited a Bible that had been monastically capitulated. So we see that here, the list here from a monastic use. So, and they adapted to a new one. For example, here. And the new one is obviously the Parisian one, dating from the time of Etienne Langton, the beginning of 13th century. Sometimes forgetting to delete the old one. So if you are taking it very closely, if you are looking very closely, you see that's the new one, but they forgot to delete the old 23 capitulation. What's more, they attached just before the Ordo Librorum a table of chapter. So Leviticus, Genesis. In much the same way as Cistercian of Villers and Olne has done for an epitome of the Bible. They had inherited from Clairvaux. So probably we will see that later on. This Bible would therefore merit a special study, but I'm at least aware of the case of the Cistercian Bible of Orval, also dated of this period of transition, with the same process of correction of the chapters in the margin. In this case, the cutoff is also visible through a different aesthetic canon for the initials in Clairvaux. In fact, because of their different origins, the Bibles at Terdust and Terdun show very little homogeneity. But does a Cistercian Bible really exist? Walter Kahn had worked by sampling and had no found an homogeneous structure of Cistercian Bible. He found few Bibles of the 12th century and little agreement both on the number of volumes, 2 to 5, and on the order and composition of the parts. But Kahn's most important conclusion was to recognize in the division of the Cistercian Bible a logical order, as opposed to the Carolingian Bibles and more especially those of Tours, divided into volumes of equal weight, but where the nature of the division has no significance in itself. As Cistercian Bibles became more widespread, we can confirm Kahn's hypothesis that there were in 5 and 4 volumes. In any case, the 3 and 2 volumes version that have been preserved or attested with certainty are not the most common. Before the end of the 13th century, and the transcription of a 4-volume Bible, transcribed by Brother Henricus, introduced, the manuscripts of Duinen introduced, do not allow us to add anything to the 50 or so complete Bible that I know of, which were large and read in community before 1300. So, liturgy. Biblical tradition, but liturgical tradition too. Not a long, ponderous liturgy, as in Cluny, but a liturgy that they believe to be more authentic, because it was shorter and more sincere in the spirit of the rule. So we see the chapter 20. The thesis of the uniformity of liturgical books owes much to the so-called Statute of 1134. In fact, 1151 probably. So missale, epistolare, etc. Ubique uniformiter habeantur. The Dijon manuscripts 1114, probably copied in the years 1183 to 88, seem to provide, at least before its mutilation, the reference text for the chanting and the readings of the office and the mass, as well as the basic legislative text. However, even in the 12th century, the homogeneity of the liturgical books was not absolute. We know the text of the life of Saint Etienne d'Aubazine, in which the biographer sheds some interesting light on Cistercians' desire to set standards. The monks, says the biographer, had to recast, according to the Cistercian model, the books that had recently been composed with great difficulty according to the monastic rite. They had to write others from scratch, deleting some and copying them again, abandoning others completely and keeping some after modifying them slightly. Again, I refer to the lesson of Professor van der Putten on this topic. I quote this because Aubazine, like the Abbey of Dijon, was not a Cistercian foundation, but was incorporated into the order. In 1107, a hermit by the name of Ligerius came to seek solitude in the dunes. Attracted by his fame, a monk called Fulco joined him around 1127 to head the group and create the first abbey. 10 years later, Fulco asked his community to join Clairvaux. So the evolution of an hermetical form of life towards Benedictine and Cistercian Cenobitic formula was not an uncommon phenomenon at the time, but well-documented cases are exceptional. I absolutely recommend the article of Michel Dubuisson and Jean-François Nieus on the origin of Les Dunes. At the time when Life of Saint Stephen was written, or in the 40s in Dunes, the Citeaux exemplar, the famous Dijon manuscripts 1114, had not yet seen the light of day, and it's probable that up to that time, there was a gradual search for text to be adopted consistently in the liturgy. If we confine ourselves to the patristic readings of the office, the lectionaries, we should point out the absence of manuscripts similar to the Dijon exemplar in the libraries of northern France, Belgium, Germany, and even Austria, where the loss of manuscripts is less marked than elsewhere. Neither Turdus nor Les Dunes have a standard homiliary like that of Dijon. As the structure of the Cistercian homily is that of the Carolingian homiliary of Paulus Diaconus, Cistercian monasteries often use Paulus Diaconus, but there is no copy preserved in Bruges. Worse still, the two collections of homilies by Gregory the Great and Bede, which at the Cistercian monastery of Villers in Brabant were clearly used in the office in place of the standard homiliary, are not preserved in the two Flemish abbeys. So what can be done? The two Flemish cases are fortunate. in retaining a large number of 15th century and 16th century bindings, the very bindings that enable Albert de Rollet to distinguish between the two collections at Toulouse and Les Dunes, thanks to certain features such as the affixing of fenestrae, and allowed him to quantitatively reverse the role of the mother abbey and the daughter abbey. Until then, it was considered that it was the abbey of the Dunes, due to the reunification of the two collections in 1624, and the impression of the famous cross that possessed a greater number of manuscripts, but Albert de Rollet has shown the opposite to be true, but this is of little importance for a specific case. So the methodology to finding out about the content of patristic readings at the office should follow two main lines, which I cannot explore for this lesson. Firstly, tracking down the originalia of patristic homilies. For example, the collection of Augustinian sermons, Snowden and Quinquaginta. So I gave the example on the PowerPoint. And so an example from Radulfus Flaviacensis, you see the lessons 6, and we are new office, Lectio Prima, Lectio Segunda. And secondly, exploring the dossier of reused bindings. At least 2 ancient homiliaries have been recycled in 15th and 16th century bindings. So here, the oldest may even date back to the year 1000, at the latest 11th century. So the Porter's catalog mentions some it with much too early date. With several cross-check, we can find leaves in the bindings of 11 manuscripts in Bruges. I gave the code here, 1342, 61, and so on. And it's possible on the 12 fragments from manuscript 349, currently in the portfolio 715, but unfortunately this latter collection of fragments has not been digitized. I will show you 2 leaves from this homily book, homiliary, cut up in every possible way. The fragment from MS 42 on the left is Bede, 3rd homily here, with the liturgical indication of a 3rd reading here. So this homily by Bede was chosen by Paulus Diaconus for a Thursday de Quatuor Temporum, one of the 4 seasonal weeks here in September, a choice that the Cistercian Harding returned in the 1120s for the first 3 reading of the Nocturne and confirmed by the standard manuscripts of Dijon. I'm not going to demonstrate this with all the leaves of this homiliary, but I go to a second fragment. In the manuscripts 349. So for me, it's the delight of a codicologist with many fragments. On the right, you have the oral homily book, homiliary of the year 1000. It contains a homily on Matthew 15 for the 2nd Sunday of Quadragesima, based on Bede homily 22, but with his own wording. Homily 22, incidentally, was not chosen by Cistercian for the office. But in fact, this homiliary is taken from the so-called Bavarian homiliary, because most of the copies come from this region. And the homily 3 mentioned above also appeared in this Bavarian homiliary. This question arrays also the problem of Carolingian models in Cistercian libraries for which no overall solution is possible. On a case-by-case basis, for example, at Eberbach in the Eifel, which recovered many large manuscripts, or at Clairvaux, where half of dozen 9th century manuscripts are preserved, the network of influences can be guessed at. In Bruges, in Villers, our own, where only a few flyleaves attest to the availability of very early manuscripts in 15th, 16th century bookbindings workshops, things are more difficult. Let us say that the working hypothesis here is that this early manuscript was used by the first community of Terdust before being recycled in the 15th century. In the same binding, you can see on the left another fragment of a 12th century homiliary, the Membra de Siecta, of which may also appear in manuscript 31, 68, 11, 17, and 502. And the same procedure should be applied, but tempus fugit. Good. So I think I skipped totally the question of the fathers because I have no time. And I will probably, from the third point, only look to the first or the two first examples. So the idea for the lesson was to present every genre littéraire one after another and to take an example in the Bruges documentation, but the general context was already too long. So I began with the history. Until the 13th century, history was not practiced as much in Cistercian cloister as elsewhere, at least in the early days. When it did exist, it was local and usually served to situate the monastery's exordium following the exordium of Citeaux outside the Benedictine world. It's even poorly distributed in libraries, with the exception of Citeaux exordia, which join the statutory corpus and are thus more widely distributed. The witnesses to these local histories are unique and most often come from the abbey concerned, sometimes from the mother house, such as the manuscripts of Sylvanus exordium in the Citeaux library, or from the daughter house. For example, there is a second copy of the Fontaine's exordium at Sorley. The Bruges case is very poor, so I skipped here. Is very poor because the manuscripts of the narrative of the foundation of Les Dunes that Dubuisson and Hughes attempted to restore has disappeared. I had a good example here from two manuscripts of the same text, one copied from the other probably, but it will take too long. So hagiography. On the other hand, hagiography, which is a particular form of historiography, attracted the attention of Cistercian scholars for edifying aims because it is the edifying aim of the narrative and not the narrative itself that determines the compositional processes. Laudatory digression, biblical and patristic reminiscences. The aims can be very different. In case of the Vita Bernardi, the aim was to prepare a well-crafted dossier for the Romana Curia with a view to obtaining canonization. Elsewhere, the aim was to record the deeds of humble monks or lay people in order to compile collections in which the preacher or devout reader could find edifying examples. For example, the Exordium Magnum by Conrad of Eberbach or the Liber Miraculorum by Caesarius of Heisterbach. These two great literary standards are absent in Les Dunes or Terdust. But there is a fine copy of the Vita Bernardi in 5 books by Geoffroy d'Auxerre from the early 13th century. This is a seminal text for spirituality and hagiography in general. I would like to point out a first element. When Geoffroy comes to the account of the crucial moments of the saint's death, he quotes Bernard's own account of his last illness in a letter addressed to Arnaud de Bonneval. In the manuscripts, this letter from Bernard is rubricated. So you see the rubrication here, which is not often the case in the preceding paragraphs. And the paradigm shift on the part of the hagiographer has already been noted. Here he reverses the relationship between document and narrative that seemed natural in the Middle Ages. in the protest of the hagiographers of the early Middle Ages, the document was on the side of indisputable historical fact, while their own account risked being denounced as biased or even false. For Geoffroy, the hagiographer could report external biographical facts, but to get known the subject intimately, it was better to have recourse to a subjective document. And the turning point came in the context of a hagiography that was decidedly more sensitive, even emotional, where, like Bernard, when he exhorted his disciples, it was necessary to speak to the heart in order to convince. Having long been convinced by Geoffroy, historians now believe that he invented this letter from Bernard for the occasion. And it was only after he had seen the light of day in this precise hagiographical text that it was included in Bernard's correspondence. I would point another fact in this manuscript 32. So it's obviously the ownership at the end of the manuscript. So you see the first ownership here, Tordust, 12th century, but here you have also Es liber hic sancti Bernardi clarivalensis. It means it's the studium, the Parisian studium of the Cistercian in Paris. So the manuscript followed the route of a Flemish Cistercian scholar to Paris and back. This leads to a third observation. On the folio 147, in parchment written in a cursive documentary script widely used by intellectuals in the first half of the 14th century, also shed new light on the presence of a free leaf before the Vita Bernardi, which in the first half of the 14th century transmitted the two letters of Alexander III, canonizing the Burgundian saint, probably done in Paris. So I won't have time to go into this, but the role of these Flemish Cistercian monks in Paris at the end of the 13th century and during the first decades of the 14th century was decisive, and certain manuscripts illustrate this English novelty, which was to become Occam's nominalism, among others, in Paris. So sermons and theology, I had a beautiful case from the Sermones in Cantica. Maybe I can leave that for the people if they are interested, but I think I already took my 15 minutes. And so I had here very quickly a beautiful case of Bernard with some indexes, a table only to be seen in a Merton manuscript, but here with the attribution to an English abbot. So it's very interesting. And also the way he's quoting, it's a bit like in Villers et Aulne, and also with a sort of index, alphabetical index of every sentences in the Sermones in Cantica for Bernard. So you may see here in the table, for example, dolor pro peccatis, qualis debet esse. So you see 26D, it means the folio 26 and the column D, because the open book, in the open book would be the RB, the fourth column in an open book. So it's exactly the same as in Villers and Aulne. So I had another examples for the epistolary literature, but I think I have done too much for this lesson, maybe for another. Thank you very much.